Mini episode 1306 of the FDH Lounge is brought to you by Sportsology, delivering unconventional columns and webcasts about sports, TV, music, movies, and more. Follow them on the web at sportsology.com.
The FDH Lounge. You'll want to schedule your life around it.
A long time ago, on a gloomy, wet Cleveland spring night, two men stand alone amidst the late-night drizzle. Their voices echo across the vacant station parking lot as they debate the merits of the great American radio show that have been missing for far too long. On that night, an idea was born. That idea became the FDH Lounge. Welcome to the FDH Lounge.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to FDH Lounge mini episode 1306. This is FDH Lounge managing partner Rick Morris. We have with us here today good friend, longtime FDH Lounge dignitary, FDH NBA analyst specifically, Ben Chu. We are previewing the 2020 NBA draft, and of course, under the circumstances here, this being the year 2020, it is taking place several months after it is supposed to. It is not generally held in mid-November. Generally by mid-November, we're well into the next season, but again, it's 2020. And we are still in the process of getting ready for the next season with the most truncated off-season of all time. And right in the midst of it here, again, we have the NBA draft. It will be taking place virtually, I believe, from NBA headquarters next Wednesday night, November the 18th, and will be, of course, transmitted as per usual on the ESPN network. And this will be a thing here. Our preview that we're doing, this will be embedded in the cover. You want to go check this out because it is getting uploaded at about the same time as this podcast. Pro Hoops Draftology 2020. It's our look at the draft from the FDH Lounge, FantasyDraftHelp.com, and Sportsology. Mock draft, rankings in there, team needs, etc., etc., etc. So this preview that we're doing is a wonderful augmentation of that. So pleased that my good friend Ben Chu could make the time to do this here today. Ben, a pleasure to have you on as always, my friend. And I don't know if this will be a draft class worthy of the conversation we're about to have. Let's hope so.
It's going to be an interesting one, Rick. If I've always learned anything about the drafts that are not as clear-cut as the other ones, we have a lot of intriguing prospects. So I think it's simple just to jump in. Jump ahead on this one. There we go.
Yeah, and we'll have to see how it plays out because this is one of these things where, again, it is not worth tanking in a year like this to get any of the top picks here. Coming into the year, there were any number of players thought to be perhaps tank-worthy, and the ones that are basically at the top of the draft class are among them. In any order, you will see on all draft boards the following three players: Anthony Edwards, shooting guard from Georgia; LaMelo Ball, point guard who played internationally this past year, he of the famous father, unfortunately, and other famous brothers; and James Wiseman, center at Memphis for approximately 15 minutes this past year, but we'll still list him as a center from Memphis. And then on some boards, you will see the consensus player of the year in college, Obi Toppin, listed as being part of the top tier. There's questions about whether he might perhaps be a tweener at the next level, what his ceiling might be. He's got a higher floor than most. He's a 6'9" power forward from Dayton. And Obi Toppin is a guy who, again, many people think will be staying in the state of Ohio, perhaps dropping to the Cleveland Cavaliers with the 5th pick here. But it's those four players, by and large, that people tend to have rated the highest. It seems likely, Ben Chu, that some combination of Edwards, Ball, Wiseman will be going 1, 2, 3. There is a possibility that there may be a player or players going before Toppin. It's possible there may be a player or players going before one of those three. It's not necessarily that likely, but I would say it's possible, if only because it may be very difficult to find teams interested in trading up to get these guys. And if you're Golden State at 2 or Charlotte at 3, and there's somebody you like outside of quote-unquote this top 3, you may just make that move there.
Right, and I think the real issue right now is that since this isn't a super top-heavy draft, a lot of trying to remember if I'm remembering correctly. At some point in one of the early 2010 drafts, they set the record, I believe it was 7 or 8. We might see even more than that, just based on how sort of lackluster the college bracket guys essentially came out. And I think it's going to be interesting to see because we're seeing a lot of rising from a lot of the Euro prospects, including Demjanovic, who has been linked to teams like Cleveland and Chicago. Killian Hayes, the kid who played at Bonifacio Home in Germany, who's been linked to the Knicks and the Pistons. And then, I mean, one guy that we didn't get to really talk about too much, but who has been rising because of the running of Bam Adebayo, was USC freshman big man Onyeka Okongwu. And it's going to be interesting to see because he was the guy that could have been projected, who was sitting in the middle of the draft and has now risen up based on how Bam performed in the playoffs for Miami. And guys essentially looking to these teams now starting to look for flexible big guys who can pass and make.
Yes, that's an excellent point. I'm very glad you mentioned it in that context because I was going to if you didn't, because there is a sense now, and I think it was an article on The Ringer talking about the growing concept of playmaker fives. You got the Joker in Denver, who is sort of the modern pioneer of that. Not the all-time pioneer, right? Because Wilt was a playmaker as well as a scorer, but you got to go way back on that. You look at Bam Adebayo, and now we're starting to look at a trend. We're seeing teams that went deep in the playoffs that had a playmaking five, and for Okongwu, the ability not just to score, which again, that remains, as is the question a lot of times, right, with power forwards / centers, what's their offensive upside? He still has some questions to answer in that regard there. But the ability to set up his teammates, this is something where, as you say, because of everything Bam was able to do, Okongwu clearly benefits from that, and the thought in a lot of teams here, hey, maybe this guy could grow to do the same thing for us.
And I think also this is the effect of when the Lakers won the title with Anthony Davis as well as that.
Sure.
There hasn't really, and I remember there was a point made about this, I think it was on Twitter, said the difference is that we're not seeing true small ball in the NBA, but what we're seeing is positionless basketball essentially.
A little bit.
I think the issue is moving forward is that big guys are always going to be big guys. Big guys are always going to be around. We never were going to see a scenario where big guys were ever going to fully disappear from basketball. We're going to see the evolution of how these guys are going to start to play. And it will not shock me if 5 to 10 years from now we see a guy very similar to Shaq coming to the league again. So again, it's always the one thing that we as human beings, we've learned anything from the COVID time, we're terrible at seeing into the future. So what we are seeing though in the league is that we're starting to see how positionless basketball and how spread basketball is allowing big guys to react and play just as well. We're just not seeing as many 7-footers who can just run and dunk as much as they used to.
Right. And when you talk about that somebody who maybe a year ago could have been said to project potentially like Shaq, not in terms of his physicality, right, because Shaq was pretty much one of a kind when it came to having that frame, but in terms of a dominant offensive and defensive game, James Wiseman. Of course, the questions were going to be how he was going to blossom offensively. We only got to see, 3 games of that from Memphis here. I was a guy that, as you know, a year ago, I was just like obsessed with the notion of the Cavs being able to get him in the draft. And now, the notion that he won't drop to the Cavs at 5, I'm like, meh, because this is a guy that could just as easily be a guy, I don't want to say a bust necessarily, but a guy who doesn't live up to the billing of wherever he gets taken. If he develops that offensive game, then he's probably going to be the best player from this draft. But if he doesn't, he's going to be fairly interchangeable, I think.
Right, and I think the issue, too, with Weissman and just the entirety of this draft is that I cannot conceive of a draft break because even though the NCAA tournament was canceled, you would think that we have a better sort of knowledge of these college players in America than anybody else. But it feels like we don't really know a lot about anybody, really. There's no one had a super breakout season. Even Anthony Edwards, top overall, who's projected as the #1 overall guy, played for a Georgia team that wasn't really good. And he struggled at times very noticeably with playmaking and trying to make the correct call. Now, the question everyone's going to ask about Anthony Edwards is, was it because his teammates were terrible and he had to do all these things? Or was it because he just had absolutely absolutely no idea how to make his teammates better. And those are two separate things. And in the case of Weissman, he on paper looks like what everyone would want, a flexible big guy who's a rim runner who can get blocked. The question you have to ask now is that, well, he can match up with certain guys, but if his offensive capabilities are limited, you can't keep a guy on the floor for that long because he'll just attack constantly.
Right, exactly. If he's a guy that can't space the floor, he shouldn't even be considered a lottery pick. But at this point, teams are looking at him as though he may be able to become that, and that would be, a wise calculation for one of these teams here. I don't know that it's a wise calculation as high as he's going to go, but we'll see. It's an interesting thing here. We did not get to see any of these teams in March Madness. That was, of course, when the COVID-19 shutdowns began happening. So we got, maybe 80-85% of a body of work of these players we got to see last year, but not the most critical games. And those are sometimes opportunities for players to separate themselves a little bit. When you're talking about this draft class, you were talking about Anthony Edwards, one of the guys that I look at that, and this might seem really unfair to single out somebody from this draft class as a poster child, but a year ago, this was not considered to be a bad draft class. This was considered to be a draft class that really could be pretty doggone good and really, really, really strong at the point guard position. And one of the guys that was a candidate to go number one a year ago, I'm looking at the most recent NBA Draft.net mock draft, which, by the way, that's an excellent site resource to use. I go to this thing all the time. And they have Cole Anthony, point guard from North Carolina, 15th. And again, I don't want to dump on the kid excessively, call him a poster child for the class, but the way he slid from the top of the draft class down sort of mirrors the way that you look at this crop overall. This is a crop that you thought going into the season could be really good. I was concerned, again, as a Cavs fan, we don't need another point guard, and it looks like it's going to be point guard heavy. And then here now, at the end of the season, I think any of us would be hungering for any type of automatic answers at any position, but there's no Zion Williamsons in this draft.
No, and I think that there's still a lot of great prospects out there, and we'll mention a bunch of them coming up. But the real question I ultimately have for a lot of teams is that in a draft where teams were not really allowed to scout like they normally would, but they've had so much time to look at tape, the prevailing opinion is that they're going to make less calculated risks. But I would also assume we want to take more risks because there is really no clear-cut guy who's going to pan out on the next level. Like you can say Weissman, Edwards, LaMelo Ball are the top three guys in this draft, no question. But they all have their faults. They all have their problems. And I think the real question is ultimately going to be is that in this draft class, who's going to be the guy that kind of moves forward? And I think this kind of just feels like one of those draft classes where you're going to have a lot of talented guys that go in the top. Some of the better players are going to go in the late lottery, post-lottery spots.
Yeah, and I think in looking at this, by the way, LaMelo Ball, who is the one guy on the quote-unquote top tier that we haven't really talked about much yet. I mean, for him, I don't want to oversimplify, but isn't it the same thing, more or less, basically, that you get with anybody the last name Ball? Peerless court vision, but what's the guy going to be like as a shooter/scorer? And that's the thing that keeps him from being what would be the automatic number one pick overall. At his size, 6'8", granted he's only 180 right now, so he's thin as hell, but at his size, man, if he could shoot, he'd be the slam dunk number one. But we don't know how well he can shoot. The early returns are not as promising, and that's why he's a question mark, but still on that top tier because everybody's a question mark to some degree or another.
Right. And with every NBA draft we've ever done, we've always had to make analysis points and figuring of what these prospects are always going to project out to be. It just feels like you would think a draft like this with the amount of time that GMs and scouts have had to look at these guys, even though they haven't seen them in person as much as like individual workouts, they've had time to study a lot of tape. This is not like we're not in a scenario where studying tape is an impossibility.
Right.
So we're going to see how it feels almost like there's two ways this draft will go. On one side, it's going to be just a free-for-all and anything goes sort of narrative, or it's going to be a lot of calculated moves. So
right.
it could be a mixture of both. And that's what I think makes this draft just so on the outset was so entertaining because no one in the world is going to know what's just going to happen next.
Exactly. And once you get off of...
That's right.
That's right. And if there's one guy in here that a lot of people really do think they can get a handle on, it would be Obi Toppin, the aforementioned power forward from Dayton. And that's a guy that, again, he looks like he's going to be a really, really good NBA player. I think the question is how great he's going to be. Right now, he had the foremost concerns with him would be on the defensive end of the floor, and questions about how well he is going to improve in that regard. That could make him a tough fit for a team like the Cavs, who already have a putrid team defense as it is. Albeit, again, they could really use a young guy with his offensive upside in the front court. So Toppin is a guy where, again, if he was better defensively, if you could look at him and necessarily project that he was going to be as dominant at the pro level as he was at the college level, then, hey, he would be the lock to go number one.
Right, and especially with Toppin during the season, he clearly performed as one of the best players in the college timeline, no question. It's just like you said, his defense, especially his pick and roll, is lacking. And he is, and the only knock I currently have on him is he's a little undersized. He's big, burly, and strong, but he's undersized for the pro game.
Mm-hmm.
And on some level, he's more of a 3 than a 4, but he's really a 3. So
yeah,
I'm kind of struggling where you kind of place him on the hierarchy. Like I think you play him as an Omar Stoudemire type power forward, but you also have to question in the long run: was this more just because he played against an NCAA, a weaker crop of NCAA players, or is this more because he's actually as good as he showed us that day?
All right, I want to ask you that then. Let's just look at him for a specific instance in terms of the Cavs roster, because this is one that I can immediately envision what you're talking about here. As far as if you want to start the guy with some minutes at the 3, that's the Cavs' most immediate need as it stands right now. But in terms of how he measures up defensively, is there the potential for ugliness if you have him at the 3? Next to 2 of the 3 guys, let's say 2 out of these 3, Andre Drummond, Kevin Love, Larry Nance Jr. Is it potentially ugly to slide him in at the 3 with those guys, or is that something you could see gelling okay?
I mean, you could gel, but again, in my opinion, it decides on what you're trying to play just overall with his nature. I mean, you could use him even as a flex guy at the 5 to have him run around in terms of those red formations that the Suns used to run all the time during the 7 seconds or less era. But I just struggle with him only because collegiately he was a fantastic player. But there was times it kind of felt like he was overpowering a lot of dudes who just had no chance against him.
Right.
And in the NBA, that clearly will flip really quickly. But he has the rim running ability and all these great abilities to make plays, and he's always very heady. He doesn't strike me as a guy with a big ego, so that would really fit a lot of teams right away. And it's weird because a lot of these college prospects don't really have huge egos.
Right.
Guys like Tyrese Halliburton from Iowa State and guys like Tyrone Terry from Stanford were now projected as these guys who be really good. But you also don't know where to really put them in terms of the hierarchy of the top college prospects. And I would think with how the league is trending, it's going to be really interesting to see guys like Isaac Okoro, Steve from Villanova, and guys like Devin Vassell from Florida State, where they're going to eventually end up, because I see those guys to be either fantastic or they could be bust.
Right. And this next tier down, once you get past Toppin, it's a tier that goes basically from 5 down to the end of the lottery and perhaps just a shade below it. You mentioned a couple of the guys there, looking at it positionally, point guards. Tyrese Halliburton seems to me to be one of the most beloved prospects of all time. Not necessarily in terms of talent, although I'm not ripping on his talent either, but in terms of leadership, upside, or not upside necessarily, but attitude and the intangibles, so to speak here. Tyrese Halliburton, point guard from Iowa State. You also mentioned the point guard from Stanford, Tyrell Terry, when you're looking at other guys in there as well. at the point guard position. You mentioned before internationally he played in France last year. Killian Hayes, 6'5" point guard, who is thought to be, again, very heady and very smart as a player.
I'm going to say, he said he played in France, he played in Germany.
Okay, well all right.
He played in Germany. If we're talking French, you're talking about Theo Maldon.
Well, wait a minute. I'm going to throw NBA Draft.net under the bus because it says France here. So is that his extraction, perhaps?
He played at France because he's been prior, but he played for Basketball Home in Germany.
Okay.
We had a lot of time, Rick.
Okay. All right.
I've seen some German basketball in my lifetime.
Okay. I love you, NBA Draft.net, but clean it up, my friends. So,
clean it up.
Yeah. And in terms,
they weren't fully wrong. They should have just updated that.
Yes. Point well taken. In terms of swingmen here, Tyrese Maxey from Kentucky, he's thought to go more towards the bottom end of the lottery if he makes it there. By the way, Cole Anthony also at point guard, since I threw him under the bus before. That's a guy that has a chance to make the back end of the lottery at point guard, 6'3" point guard from North Carolina. But other swingmen, you have somebody who was a sort of fast riser in the off season here to lock his way probably into the draft lottery. Devin Vassell from Florida State, shooting guard. You have Isaac Okoro, the shooting guard / small forward from Auburn, who you and I talked about him off air. Elite defensively, offensively, what's he going to be? Don't know. And if I was a Cavs fan, I would be very leery on the gamble of that. Sadiq Bey, the small forward from Villanova. This is a pretty good draft, basically, for swingmen in this level here, basically. Aaron Nesmith, the swingman from Vanderbilt. He could play a little bit, perhaps, of shooting guard or small forward. As you start to get a little bit bigger in there, you have the small forward / power forward swingman Patrick Williams, also from Florida State. And you have Jalen Smith, power forward from Maryland. And Precious Achiuwa, the small forward / power forward from Memphis. Boy, what a team Memphis could have had if he could have played with Wiseman last year. So these are all guys, and there might be some generous folks that still put point guard / shooting guard swing. R.J. Hampton, who played internationally last year, might put him on that tier. Most probably wouldn't, I suppose. But these are the guys you can look at going immediately after Toppin, perhaps even before him, as we mentioned. And then, along with Okongwu, who you talked about before, he certainly belongs in that conversation as well, all the way through probably the end of the draft lottery and perhaps a bit beyond.
Right, and I think, again, with the European prospects, there's a lot of interesting guys. Like, I know we just mentioned Theo Maldon, who played at LBFC in France, who was just a fantastic. He's still really young, 18, with a 6'8" body who can make great passes. Guys who are like trailing down the bottom of the draft. Someone from Barcelona FC, Leandro Balomo, who was another great big body who can make big passes, was compared to Joel Ingles during his time at FC Barcelona. One of the more interesting risers that I've been seeing over the last couple of days was obviously the kid Alexander. Can we get the correct pronunciation of that, Rick? Alexander, is that Polkow?
Alexei Paklivsevelsky, is that the one? Alexei
Paklivsevelsky,
Yes, from Serbia.
He's been a guy that was initially I thought was linked to OKC, the Thunder, for a long time, and he's been now slowly rising up the draft stock. He was initially listed as a early second round pick, but I think people love his 7-foot frame. He's lanky, he needs to grow into his body, but could shoot the lights out of Olympiacos. So, I mean, it's a very interesting European draft, and it's weird because normally on this timeline we know a little bit more about the European prospect than we do the college prospect, but I feel like they're on even footing this year, to be honest.
Sure. I mean, and I'm very enamored of that kid. Again, though, 7 foot 190. I mean, this is a guy that makes the late great Manute Bol look obese by comparison. So the amount that he's going to have to fill out. They got him listed as a center at NBADraft.net. I mean, just to play power forward, this guy'd have to put on 30 pounds. But, you know, Yeah, that kind of upside, a guy that big that can shoot like that, that's what the game is moving towards essentially. And he is considered by Draft.net to be an early second round guy, but that's a guy where, yeah, like if my Cavs were trading back, that's a guy I'd want him to be all over. And also, too, you can always buy draft picks in the second round, generally speaking, probably even more so with the coronavirus, right? So Dan Gilbert, with his willingness to do that, if he could swoop in and get a second round pick and take him, that would be very, very outstanding. And it's not like he hasn't done it before, because it's more or less what he did with Kevin Porter Jr. a year ago. Granted, there were 4 second-round picks involved in that, but as I said at the time, second-round picks come and go. Kids with KPJ's upside don't. You have, in looking at this here, the second-round projections, it's interesting. Some guys that, again, I had seen projected to go higher than this at earlier points in time, and so potentially guys that could be good value here in the second round. Isaiah Stewart, the power forward / center from Washington, perhaps a bit undersized, and I think maybe that's why he might be sliding, but a guy who had a very, very solid pro career. Speaking of Isaiah Joe, I've seen him going a lot higher than this. The point guard / shooting guard from Arkansas, who's considered to be now on their mock draft a mid-second round pick. Trey Jones, the point guard from Duke, just nauseates me that they have him going to Golden State. As a Golden State hater, I can see them turning that kid around and maximizing his upside. So even in the second round, and again, late second round, the projection here is that Philly takes Cassius Winston, point guard out of Michigan State. That could be intriguing. So again, somebody like him, not the highest ceiling in the world, but I mean, pretty good floor as a rotational guy potentially. So even in the second round this year, again, this isn't a weaker second round than usual. The first round, and particularly the top of it maybe, but the second round gives you a chance for depth just as good as you would find in any other draft.
And honestly, I think some arguments are to be made for the tail end of this draft having a bunch of great prospects. One guy I did want to mention before we get to it is Kira Lewis, the kid from Alabama.
Yes.
Microwave support, who I think could be sort of a new age Lou Williams type. So I think he could be very good for maybe a team like Portland, maybe a team like the Orlando Magic, who is still trying to figure out their point guard scenario. But this is a very deep draft. I mean, enough. Some other guys are at just the tail end and possibly going into the second round. Guys like Malachi Flynn from San Diego State, who was solid the entire timeline. We're getting a lot of sort of Mountain West. Nate Pritchard, the kid from Oregon, was not initially in the tail end of the second round, but he's been flying up because of his ability to score and get to the basket. One guy that everyone seems to be loving. I'm not sure if I'm the guy who wants to really like him, but I see why everyone does. Desmond Bain, the kid from TCU, just does everything great on the floor. I don't know where his ceiling is, but he can just do it all. And another guy, we mentioned Isaiah Stewart from Washington. We have to obviously mention Jaden McDaniel, who had a very disappointing sort of career at Washington, but has all the promise of a guy who can be flexy and make big plays and shoot three-pointer from the power forward position. We tend to forget this is one of those weird classes where if we're looking at like a lot of the high school talent that was coming up, they're still going in the first round. Guys like LaMelo, Anthony Edwards, Jaden McDaniel. So there's being a lot of guys, and then once we get to the bottom of the second round, I still think there's a lot of guys who, despite what people think about them, I think could be really just totality great guys. One guy that we didn't really get to mention, but who I've been kind of relatively high on, just overall, if I'm being honest, is Captain Stanley from Duke. In case you remember, he broke Zion Williamson's vertical leap record at Duke, so he's going to be a big flexy guy who could be really, really good. And a guy who I'm not super high on, Rick, but I can see why people are. Emmanuel from Kentucky, a guy who's 6'3", has a 6'8" wingspan, who can make big passes and get to the basket when needed. So I don't think this is one of those years where you might see a bunch of guys near the end of the draft who would have normally been maybe higher in the second round or into the late first round. It's going to be very interesting to see. And a lot of these blue chip schools like Kentucky and Arizona are going to have a lot of guys go, like, guys like Ashton Higgins. One guy who carry going up a little bit based on the data and based on the numbers. But it's going to be very interesting to also, let's not forget another 3-and-D guy, because we love talking 3-and-D guys. Josh Green is a guy that's been projected to go in the late first round as well.
Yep, a lot to unpack there. But a couple things here I want to tie into on what you said when you were talking about one of the Duke guys here. Another one of them that, in terms of somebody that had a little bit more gloss coming out of high school than what we ended up seeing, a guy with a little bit more of an old school big body here, Vernon Carey, projects as a possible power forward / center, 6'10", 270. That's another guy that perhaps a year ago there was a little bit more shine on him as a prospect than now. But if you get him later in the first round or maybe even early in the second, could be tremendous value.
Yeah, and I mean, some other guys, if you just want to talk about second rounders who could make big efforts. Devin Dotson from Kansas, kind of built in that Mario Chalmers sort of body that can go out there, defend, and make three-pointers when he needs to.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, another guy who we didn't hear about from this year, but I remember from the prior years that he was getting a lot of discussion, was Marcus Howard from Marquette.
Sure.
And he's going to be really interesting to see where he's going to fall, because I think he's a 4-year senior coming out of Marquette. And as we know, the 4-year seniors coming out of Marquette that can make big plays and shoot the three. It's going to be very interesting to see what's going to come of him, because in a draft that I think we're going to start to see a lot of guys, we're filling out the back of rotation block in the NBA more than we used to. Because you remember too, Rick, before this sort of spread offense revolution in the NBA, it was mainly like your first 7 or 8 guys, and then everyone else is going to be projects or you can screw out there. Now it feels like you need to have consistent 9, 10, 11, 12 guys.
Sure.
To have. So we're going to see a lot of these second rounders who might not normally make a team just because of the COVID-19 pandemic, because we're not going to see, because we still do not know what the G League's going to look like or how the college season is going to look like moving forward. So there's going to be a lot of, this might be the year you see a lot of teams buy their way in, like you said, buy their way into the second round, or even take a guy who they might not like, but they would project out better than a guy possibly from the next draft class, because we're going to have no clue exactly when the next NBA draft is going to be.
Right, exactly, and that's where
we assume the timeline will be the same, but we don't know.
Yeah, I mean, I think it'll be closer to what we have come to see, but probably not exactly the same. My guess would be July or August for that. If we're looking at second-round guys also, too, and if I'm going to be consistent with the last thing of commenting on bodies, a real old-school, had a big-body guy, Omar Yurtseven, the 7-foot, 275 center from Georgetown. And that's a guy where it's like, man, boy, can you imagine if that guy could ever develop really soft hands, how valuable he'd be?
Right. And I mean, if you're just kind of looking at, it's a guard-heavy draft, but you guys got a lot of good big guys too. People tend to forget Daniel Otaku from Minnesota, 6'10", can make big plays. And, you know, Doka Azubuike from Kansas is also another guy that we're just going to see what it's going to be. And again, it would be weird to say because we've been going away from big guy centers, but I expect with the rise of how Anthony Davis was able to just batter these teams in the Western Conference, you're going to start to see teams start to fill those rotation roles out differently.
I believe so also, too. And you mentioned Kira Lewis before. I need somebody to design a meme for me, and it would be a passing the baton meme from Alabama defensive line factory to Alabama point guard factory. I need that meme stat.
Right. I know, at some point it's going to matter.
Yes, and you know, as you said, he is somebody that could really fit in nicely with a team here. And when you're looking at specific fit for teams, again, you have by and large your usual assortment toward the top of the draft of teams in a sort of a sad sack position one way or another. As you get down at number 10, the exception to that might be Phoenix based on how they played in the bubble. And if you look at the NBA Draft.net projection for them, I mean, does it get any better than this? If they're able to get Killian Hayes at 10, and when point guard is by far their most glaring need.
Sure. And I mean, sorry for interrupting, but I will note, though, we also have to remember that a couple of days ago there was a report that they were possibly looking to acquire Paul from OKC, and there's also discussion that Russell Westbrook is now going to be out on the market
Sure.
So we're going to see a lot of movement, I think, in the draft. It's going to be interesting to see how easily it's going to be for teams to trade out of the first 3 picks. Because normally, if it's a loaded draft, it's really hard. But this is going to be one of those drafts where no one really knows what everyone's kind of looking for. And it's kind of weird because I'm not going to make this argument that this isn't a talented draft at all. It might be one of the more just overall talented drafts we've seen in a while. But the weird part is that there's no guy that I would see outside of maybe LaMelo Ball that I would go up and get right away.
Yeah, and that's a good point.
I don't think I'm super in love with any of these prospects. Right? Like Weissman might be the second guy, and Edwards is interesting. But the weird part with Edwards is that he's a little bit of an undersized 2 guy.
Yep.
So there's not really, I don't know the market really for what he can bring, even though he's a fantastic athletic phenomenon that is going to improve on the next level. It's very interesting because if you look through the landscape of the NBA, a lot of teams kind of have that figured out already. And it's weird to see, and you're going to start to see guys making moves and trades. I mean, another guy that we talked about Phoenix, so I'm just going to use the flip side. We'll talk about Chicago. Zach LaVine's also been on the trade block recently.
Sure.
So it's going to just really interesting to see what a lot of these like middle tier like names that NBA fans know where they're going to end up, because they always like to say chaos usually breeds more chaos, and at the end of the day, this is really a chaotic draft timeline.
Exactly. And the other team here, again, a team that I, being a lifelong Cavs fan, sort of loath to bring up, but you have to. They're a big story of this draft. Golden State at number 2. With the Splash Brothers coming back this year to play with Draymond Green, they're in a real straddle between play for now, play for later. And again, they're in a position where, like you said, because of the lack of sure things in this draft, it's not like they can just turn around and flip that. I think they're begging if they can get like a Bradley Beal or somebody like that that's a sure thing for that pick there. There's projections in a lot of the mock drafts of LaMelo Ball going there, and it's intriguing in the sense that Steph Curry could play off the ball more, where he is equally effective. Thought that James Wiseman could be a guy to give them that other element in the front court that they haven't had. I've even seen a mock draft or two where Okongwu goes in that spot. So for Golden State, there's any number of ways they can go. As somebody that loathes the team, I'm happy to say there's nothing they can do that is a sure bet to make them any better than they are.
And I mean, another analysis point we have to note from their entire history, the Warriors are a very interesting team right now. Because most of the time when you get to this timeline in the dynasty timeline, the parts are kind of done, essentially.
Right.
Like, they're happy, there's problems, but the Golden State team relatively kind of got made punt of the year in a year that was just so batty that I don't even think anyone's really truly going to remember this team for Golden State. And they got to develop a lot of their young talent, and they definitely found a couple of guys who I think are going to, just definitely work with them moving forward. And the question for them is that if they take White, he's the best long-term pick for them because he's really young and he's really flexible. We haven't seen Golden State with a guy who is like that, really.
Right.
Like, we've seen them with JaVale and we've seen them with Andrew Bogut, but we've never seen them with an athletic big guy. And if you say a Okongwu too, we've never really seen Golden State with that sort of a guy. Think about if they do take a Okongwu, you're going to essentially have him and Draymond able to pass the ball at any given moment.
Sure.
That's going to be scary for a lot of teams. And on the flip side, if we're going to talk about trading out of the pick, one team that's intrigued by that pick is San Antonio. I heard there was rumors that Marcus Aldridge would be possibly a one-for-one swap. And San Antonio might be a seller at this time when they get younger. So DeRozan, you can also throw him out on the trade block as well. It's a lot of established stars could be on very soon. And it's going to be very interesting to see where a lot of them are going to end up.
Yes, and I absolutely think it is going to be intriguing for that. And the thing that I wanted to mention here at the end as a little bit of a teaser is once we get beyond the draft, once we get into free agency, we'll be doing, of course, subsequently a season preview in the NBA that's going to be a lot sooner than anybody could believe it would feel like at this time because of this really truncated off season. But before that, as I talked to you about off air, we've been talking about this for a little bit here, doing a special segment on the show, just kind of examining something that almost feels like it ties directly into the theme of this year's draft, because you're looking at this draft and it is going to be paramount on player development, because there are really no sure things in this draft. Whoever you take, A, you better gamble correctly on what their upside is, and B, you better have a system in place that can unlock that. And it's not like, I haven't meant to imply recently on the show that we've never seen it before recent years. Obviously, it was a key towards San Antonio's dynasty that they had. The continual ability to develop guys like Tony Parker and Manu, subsequently Leonard. But that almost feels right there. And when you look at the 2011 draft with Leonard, as though sort of the beginning of the modern NBA in the sense of not the trend towards wide open offense necessarily per se and the threes and all of that, but player development, which I think might be the story of the 2020s, because you had Miami and Denver in the final four of this year's draft, and this year's playoffs, I should say, and neither team had a guy on among their recent draft picks where it was like, oh, this guy is a lock to be a future franchise player in the NBA. I think Jamal Murray was the highest pick out of any of the core guys for Denver, and that is not by any stretch of the imagination a guy that anybody was saying, oh, he could definitely be a franchise player. He was a guy where it was like, sure, if they unlock him, he could be really good, and he's turned out to be even better than that. Miami and Denver, they, I think, they're giving hope to a lot of fans in this league, and I would count myself among them as a Cavs fan, because this whole waiting for Godot kind of thing here of like, we're going to tank and hopefully we tank the right year and there's a franchise guy coming out. I mean, look, what the Cavs did, getting LeBron in 03, I'm not going to say quite a once-in-a-lifetime thing because it happened in New Orleans subsequently, with Zion. Once in a while you make it happen, but most of the time it doesn't happen. And player development is the thing that gives it's the key towards true parity in this league. If we see more teams being able to do what Miami and Denver are doing, building those programs, and this year's draft, I think, ties into it perfectly. And I think when we have that conversation in the next several weeks, we'll be looking back on this draft and maybe looking at what players are in what situations coming out of this draft and where they might be able to become possibly the next Jamal Murray, Bam Adebayo, Tyler Hero, etc.
And I think the true irony, and it's the point we do have to discuss and talk about, is that there is a distinct scenario, Rick, that the European talent in this draft, or the team that the prospects that played overseas, were significantly better than the guys that played in the NCAA in college. And it's going to be really interesting to see how a lot of these guys project out, because there's a lot of interesting prospects, but not a lot of clarity.
I would agree with that, and that's the thing here too, where when you're talking about it, I mean, it really is sort of a conundrum. Denny Avdija here, the small forward out of Israel, 6'9", 210, that guy sort of epitomizes the quandary that a lot of teams have in terms of trying to see where he can fit in. I mean, I've seen projections on this guy, and I think a lot of it comes down to on what day you saw him playing internationally. On some days you look at him and you go, wow, poor man's Luka. Sign me up for that, because I think Luka's the next generational talent in this league. And then there's a number of times where you look at it and like, I think that guy could be a slightly improved version of Cedi Osman. Well, I like Cedi Osman. I don't regret that the Cavs have him, but we don't need two of him. So that's where I'm very torn about looking in his direction. To me, that's high risk, high reward. He's going to be a rotational player. We know this. But I don't want a rotational player with a 5th pick in the draft. That I don't care about what his floor is. I don't know if he has a good enough chance of justifying, the pick with a ceiling.
Right. And the interesting part too, Rick, is that Avichal has also been linked to Golden State too, because he fits their mold to a team 6'9" guy who can shoot the three and pass the ball. Another perfect guy just for them if they're looking to possibly just keep that team together. That's what makes this draft so bizarrely interesting, because under normal circumstances you would say the teams near the top need the most help, but it also kind of feels like it's one of those drafts where you probably would want some of the middle tier teams near the top, because it doesn't really seem like any game-breaking player is going to come out of this perceptually, at least right now. obviously guys can improve and get better, but it doesn't seem like, in comparison off of kind of the Zion draft, that any one of these guys will make a splash impact right away.
Well, in terms of Denny, what you said about him fitting into Golden State, I almost want to give you the skeptical guy meme of like, but can he though? Because like, I don't know. Isn't that the big question about his scoring and his shooting? And on what day is he going to be a guy that can hit those shots? And on what day is he a guy who's going to look like John Starks on the worst day of his life? I mean, that seems to be the question with him. I would think Golden State would want more of a sure thing offensively.
Right. And I think the question for them, too, is that he could be more of a flexy guy who could be a good playmaker. The one thing I will note for him in this situation in comparison to some of these other guys like LaMelo Ball and Anthony Edwards, that I don't think his mechanics are terrible in terms of his shooting.
Right.
It's just he favors a lot when he drives.
Right.
Like, he can drive with his left side and no problem. Right side is impossible.
Sure.
And the argument I would personally make with a guy like him is that you truly don't know moving forward how he's going to project out
right
in the pro game in terms of what he truly is. And the question is, he is clearly the best, I would say, if you want to really, if we're going to take LaMelo Ball out of it, essentially, he is the best European prospect on the board for sure.
Yes.
The most surefire European Euro on the board.
Yep.
The question is going to be is that I think in the right role he'll do really well. And I always like to use this rule is if you're in the embarrassment of Richard Golden State is dealing with now it's a little bit, it's more like, a silver coin instead of a gold coin now. But if you have 4 silver coins, Rick, and you just get to add another silver coin, it's going to be good no matter how you slice it at the end of the day.
Right. Right, and that's the thing too, and that name I didn't mention before too. It's whoever they take, it's going to be some contention for how they mesh in the lineup with Andrew Wiggins as well. So it's Andrew Wiggins and the Splash Brothers and Draymond Green, and then whoever you basically plug in with them. And as you said, in a league that is getting more and more positionless all the time, it does give them some more options than they might otherwise have. But one way or another, this is going to be fun. This is going to be exciting to watch. It's going to be, again, hopefully once in a lifetime as far as being a pandemic draft. We don't need this twice in a lifetime. So it will be a pretty virtual one, as was the NFL draft earlier in the year. And it will be fun to track this thing and, of course, to see the subsequent beginning of free agency thereafter as we get forward to the December 22nd start of the season here. And we'll be tracking, as I say, all of this as we go. But Ben Chu, always a pleasure. And as I said at the outset here, hopefully the draft class can live up to the caliber of the conversation we just had.
Right. And if I've learned anything, Rick, just even judging this draft, if there's a player with the last name of Scrub, that usually means this is going to be a fun draft.
That's right. That's right. We're going to have all that to look forward to as we go through this here. Thank you so much, Ben Chu. Thank you, everybody, for joining us for FDH Lounge mini episode 1306.